After the roleplay community tapered off for various reasons during Shadowbringers, something else arrived in Endwalker to effectively replace it, a third-party tool called Mare Synchronos. Last week, the developer of Mare announced end of service for plugin following a legal notice. This video is about every part of that. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoy, it's completely free and helps me out a lot. More information on what I do and how you can support at the end. We'll start with the first of those things, the community beginning to taper off, as I feel there were many contributing factors. A major part of that was due to the lack of world growth as of late. I feel like I'm already losing people, so hold on and let me explain. MMORP scenes can only thrive with a constant influx of new ideas and concepts to work with. Therefore, with the exception of very private closed groups that do their own thing, the biggest influence on the community was the current focus of the actual narrative of the actual game. From ARR to Stormblood, this worked well for 14. The story expanded to new concepts that were grounded enough to interact with the concepts that already existed. Ishgard, Alamigo, Hingashi, Doma, the Azure Steppe. All of these were places where you could create a new character whose lore is that they're from there, and it would be reasonable for them to have travelled to the earlier zones in character. So it would be reasonable for them to be interacting with people's existing older characters. Come Shadowbringers though, the entire expansion takes place essentially off-screen, in a splinter dimension declared off-limits for anyone but the protagonist to travel between. This means that Shadowbringers offered literally zero new opportunities for the broader RP community unless you started actively defying established lore to bring your first OC to Eosia. Specifically Uldar, but we'll get there. Very few people did this as it was generally considered taboo at the time, so things began to stagnate. Endwalker was sort of similar in that about half of the zones introduced were again off-screen. The cultures it did introduce, Thavnar and Sharlayan, were cultures we already knew of from previous lore and were not introduced in ways that give them additional depth. Thavnar is Fantasy India with no internal problems, and Sharlayan is Nerd Island. Both of those things we already knew since ARR, so they did not introduce anything new to RP. Dawntrail wasn't nearly as bad as the Shadowbringers to Endwalker era for ideas. We knew Terrell was Fantasy America, but nothing beyond that, so the extra fleshing out actually meant a lot. And the Alexandria stuff is very compelling. However, it didn't really take off due to the poor reception and general low enthusiasm about the actual story, and that's definitely soured things. In my personal opinion, Aetheris as a world was at its most compelling sometime in ARR until sometime near the end of Stormblood. But as with most other things in the game, we can probably agree late Stormblood was the end of the Golden Age. Now you might wonder, why does 14 actually need a constant influx of new toys? Why doesn't the old stuff stay compelling? The reason is that pretty much any long-standing plots and political issues in 14 have either been neatly resolved with a bow on top or will never be brought up again. And any new ones are generally resolved within the same expansion. Alamigo and Doma actually got freed. The Dragonsong War actually ended. People don't get tempered anymore, but even if they did, it doesn't matter because there's a cure. The big evil empire actually fell. Gridania remains untouched with the 10-foot pole because its themes are very awkward in insert current year. I know this sounds strange as it's generally considered a strength of the storytelling, but it really doesn't do the RP scene any favours. This sort of wrapping up of things leads to a reduced workspace to write in. Aetheris as of Dawntrail is a really nice place to live, probably nicer than the real world in all honesty, something you couldn't even fathom saying about the world we were presented in 2014. Everyone mostly gets along and is on the same page with things, all the race wars and religious tensions or whatever have mostly worked themselves out. The world is improving, but long-form in-universe RP thrives when that is not the case. But let's say you want to RP in this situation anyway. You have a new idea for a first character and you want to RP as them. What do you have to do? Well, firstly, to even get your character to the zone they supposedly live in, you have to either do 70-ish levels of tedium through MSQ or buy a skip. Then you probably have to do some side grinds or cash up stuff to get the cosmetics you were interested in on that character. Only after about 100 hours or dollars can you actually now RP as that character in a fitting setting. Oh wait, you can't, because nobody else did that. Back to Uldar you go. If that sounds absurd, yeah, it kinda is, and it only gets worse with every expansion, which is why 14's RP scene is so centralized around housing and ARR zones. The world outside continues to expand, but the level of investment required to have a character actually be able to engage in that world never stops increasing. Despite dawntrail zones being beautifully designed and lore-rich, I can't imagine much if any RP is actually happening there. A potential future alternate starting point could alleviate the location issue, but for cosmetics, the only long-term solution would be account-wide stuff, which I do not think is ever happening. Lastly, the main roleplay server Balmung irreversibly changed when Aether and Priamble were split into Crystal at the end of Stormblood. Due to Balmung's placement on Aether before the Sundering, Balmung players could enjoy raiding and RP without both of those being mutually exclusive. However, contrary to popular belief, Aether was not a raiding data center. Rather, Gilgamesh was a raiding world. Therefore, Balmung and Gilgamesh being separated forced an attention split between those wanting to do content and those wanting to RP. The logical choice for players equally invested in both was to transfer their mains to Aether to do content and RP on newly made alt on Crystal, further exacerbating the alt unfriendliness issues and severing many long-term connections. While data center travel allowed Sundering refugees back onto the server, enough time had passed since the Sundering that not many prior connections were reforged, and it's still an active choice a raider has to make to go to an RP world or vice versa, as opposed to there being a single world culture that simply has both. So thanks to all that, traditional RP, the aforementioned kind of in-universe long-term character-driven stories, started to phase out. At the same time, we had a mass influx of newer players from the WoW exodus, and those players couldn't leave their homes due to the cough disease you aren't allowed to name on YouTube. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. We had all of this roleplay structure, but all of a sudden it wasn't being used for established characters. So why not use it for our out-of-character selves? That's exactly what happened in the newly formed club scene. The death of RP was used as a catalyst to create a real third space when in-person third spaces were accessible. The death of RP was used as a catalyst to create a real third space when in-person third spaces were inaccessible, not vice versa as is commonly believed. But if this was just due to the cough disease, then why did this population remain after lockdown ended? Well, to put it simply, a lot of people who benefited from this had no third space to begin with, so they had no third space to go back to when lockdown ended. Given how weird and hostile things are in person these days, third spaces in game form are easier and likely much safer than trying to find a third space in person. Beyond the context of 14, there's been a lot of meaningful discussion about the lack of third spaces, especially for Gen Z. That meaning most have nowhere to socialize that isn't home, work, or school, and that is something you should look into if you're unfamiliar. For example, a night of clubbing? Possibly every weekend? But firstly, no thank you to going alone, I'm a woman. Being spiked only takes a second or two of load guard and can happen in plain sight, and to men too. Secondly, is being drunk even a valid way to connect to people in and of itself? Generally, no. Maybe you can get lucky, but usually in the process of going sober, you'll lose touch with most of the friends you made clubbing. Last and most importantly, drinks and food are expensive as fuck, but we'll get to that. Now if we move back to nerd culture, even at a local Magic the Gathering event, the cost factor still applies. A basic draft is like, what, $25? But the exact number doesn't matter, it's the fact there's a purchase requirement to begin with. So not that, maybe D&D instead? Wait, no, game stores generally charge fees to their tables or require you to be buying something else, so that's no go too. I think the part that's lost in most gaming discourse is that gaming is a poor hobby. A scenario I hear of quite a lot is someone who clubs a lot and is pretty well off asking their gamer friend something like, well, if you have money for video games, how don't you have money to come to the club this weekend? And the simple truth is, the gamers spent their $70 in the spring. We're in September now, and they're still playing the same fucking thing. Meanwhile, the clubber is spending $70 a week. In terms of cost effectiveness, video games are extremely cheap relative to other hobbies if you're buying the right things. You get a lot more entertainment for the same amount of money. As a result, a significant portion of 14 players are kinda just 14 players, which is why the 14 club scene is the natural end result. So, with all this in mind, why are clubs actually hated? 2 reasons, actually. The first of which is a sort of mismarketing, basically. Despite being definitionally a different experience to RP, clubbing is still framed as RP. It's generally quite rare for clubbers and outsiders alike to even make the distinction, despite the distinction needing to be made. As a result, no meaningful discussion was able to happen about the death of traditional RP, and when people asked where they could find traditional RP post-death of traditional RP, they were pushed towards the club scene, instead of the small communities that are insular and isolated and private that still do traditional RP. The second is something like, once you've been to one, you've been to them all. Being involved in the club scene for enough time will inevitably lead you to the conclusion that most aren't providing distinct experiences from one another. It's the same unfitting decor, with the same few songs on the orchestrated and the same DJ on Twitch, the same guild gambling minigames, and the entire crowd is cut from the same bland cloth and limited mold that is the 14 character creator. Wait, hold on, you're saying the character creator is bad? Well, yeah, the character creator fucking sucks. There are very few options per option, and everything except hair, face, and colours are too subtle to notice. It's so bad, in fact, that you can create a near-perfect copy, practically perfect copy, of someone else's character after just a glance at them. Don't act like Glamour is much better either, though, as all of its systems are structurally antiquated regardless of the item quality. Job and level requirements are too restrictive, too many pieces are undyeable, most second dye channels quite frankly fucking suck. Glamour dresser space is too limited. It shouldn't even be limited at all. And most pieces are too awkward to use outside of their sets due to the stylist choice. And there aren't enough glamour plates, meaning you can't even keep the outfits that you do manage to make. It's a bit too limited, don't you think? That is where cosmetic mods come in, as they were used heavily to pick up Square Enix's slack, and a lot of the mods people made were just beautiful. More face and hair options to differentiate one's character or represent their real self. New outfits the game offered nothing like. Flashier combat animations for anyone who found theirs lacking, or even just more small ways to accessorize. And yes, sometimes it was used for gooning, but it always went far beyond that. The possibilities are wonderful and endless, but these mods come with a major flaw. Only you see them. If you wanted to share mods with your friends and both see each other's modded characters, you both had to install all of each other's mods, and if you were using the then preferred text tools loader, they needed to be on the same non-conflicting pieces. Needless to say, the process of sharing mod packs was very tedious, so it wasn't done too often. Until one developer asked the question, what if there was a plugin that could transfer your mod pack and all of the details over the internet directly to the other person's game in real time, so you didn't have to go through that whole tedious mod pack process every time? Enter Mare Synchronos, a dollar mode plugin doing just that, which blew up overnight, far beyond even the developer's expectations. With this final piece, exploring the world of 14 as your true self was never easier, so mod sharing with this tool became commonplace. Perhaps a little too commonplace, actually. While you may not have heard of Mare Synchronos, when you see the auto-translate for Mare Lamentarum, or Moondust, or something along those lines in adventure replays and search comments, this plugin is what that refers to. Show me someone who hasn't seen those, and I'll show you a liar. For better or worse, the plugin firmly ingrained itself into the game's culture for a significant portion of the player base. Yes, a significant portion. Towards the end of its life, Mare had 270,000 users, confirmed by Dark Archon, the developer, and Final Fantasy XIV has less than 1 million remaining players, confirmed by Lucky Banjo, who are generally seen as the most credible metric for this. If you want to be really conservative with your estimate, Mare has a quarter of the player base. Realistically, it's probably closer to a third. Anyone who calls that a small subsection is, to put it in kinder terms than they deserve, a fucking idiot. More specifically, Mare made up a majority of users who remained subbed between patches. During a time of growing dissatisfaction among just about every other demographic of players, the last people Square Enix hadn't pissed off were the social players who were mainly here for Mare and would stay regardless of Square Enix's fuck-ups. Mare users were the most dedicated base. While one could argue that it's illogical to pay a subscription for that reason when the game could be replaced with something like, say, VR chat for a better experience, I think that only further reinforces my point. Ultimately, what you're arguing is that 14 needs Mare users a hell of a lot more than Mare users ever needed 14. Then again, Mare also represented the image of the game shifting to something unintended by Square Enix that they could not anticipate or control. If there's one thing to keep in mind about Square Enix, it's that they want complete control over the way players enjoy their game at all times, in all situations, and are not willing to compromise that, even if their intentional vision isn't working. In a sense, a takedown would always have made sense. A big chunk of search results, recommendations, and social media discussion were, in a sense, no longer about the game Square Enix created. In a sense, it was about the game community had created. This, especially in a time where censorship only grows more prominent, in a time where Square Enix is trying to get their game onto the Switch and needs to appease Nintendo, could potentially harm Square Enix's image if it was found that they knew about this the entire time and did nothing. Which is true, by the way. Square Enix had a tough decision ahead. Kill Mare and lose the last bit of player trust, or relax their iron grip so the community can rebuild. If you're here from search, you likely already know they chose the former, and if you're even barely literate, you've probably inferred from the tone that I'm not very happy about it. The amount of people I've met that only stay subbed for ERP is insanely high. They're really shooting themselves in the foot with this one. It's the same with housing, they won't do instanced because it forces subs. Considering how bad the patch support for dawntrail has been, considering we've been in the same massive content drought since Endwalker, Mare had quite literally been the only thing keeping a lot of subs on. Even I stopped giving a fuck about my house and burned the bridge myself, and some of my discords are already seeing people post unsub screenshots. To be clear, I'm not upset about it as a modder. I'm upset about it because it isn't a good business decision. Most players are already reluctant to resub at this time, and this will only tip the scale in a money-saving direction for those players. Seeing as the MMO department is single-handedly keeping Square Enix out of the red, you'd think they'd do a fraction of research and avoid enraging their most dedicated base. Even if you didn't use it yourself, or you won't unsub directly because of it, you have to consider the downstream consequences too. Someone might not stop playing today, but in a few months, one of their friends says, "Hey, I'm using this other game to RP now because it's a lot better for it than 14. Why don't you come too?" And they will move with that friend. Also, content doers who relied on RP to get them through content droughts, that's more people than you might immediately think. Those people will no longer sub between patches. Another person might not even use Mare, they might even be a console player. But between all of the other issues listed, there goes half your friends list and most of the people you run content with. If a lot of their friends stop playing over this, then they probably will too. Jumping off from there now, because I need the people claiming traditional RP will come back now to shut the fuck up. What they don't realize is that people don't usually come back to RP communities that are already bleeding out or dead. The only people staying are those well entrenched within their own heavily moderated insular circles that weren't affected by community shifts to begin with, and therefore don't feel the need to leave. You're not getting new blood at this point because all of the new blood was going to the ERP and Mare side of things. The people who've already left, you're not getting them back, they're entrenched in new communities now. Even with Mare gone, it would take a concentrated effort from RP veterans building things back up for places like Balmung to go back to the way they were in mid-Stormblood. And the reason for that is because Mare was not the reason RP died to begin with, which the entire first half of the video was spent detailing. In all honesty, I seriously doubt that kind of energy is even there in the current 14 community anymore. Now, I already see some people saying, yeah, but Mare will be replaced in a week, so everything will be fine and they'll come back. And it has multiple replacements already, so maybe there's some truth to that, but that's the issue. Having multiple forks means the community is fragmented. At first there was the large group of people who want to love it since that was already established, but also the people who want nothing to do with anyone who uses that because of its bad reputation. There's also this other Snowcloak one that's been popping up in some adventure plates, and also people who don't want to use it because it's a Loperate fork, and also people who don't want to use it because it's already failed the Fight Club test. There are also some other ones popping up too, and people using them, but also people who don't trust them anymore because they're clearly only there to be an entry into the arms race to be the new Mare. The community for these plugins will never again be as united as it was under Mare. Yoshida recently released a statement about a quote-unquote theoretical mod that causes the changes of other mods to appear to other players, very blatantly subtweeting Mare. As Yoshida requested the statement to not be summarized, and I'm kinda gonna be doing that anyway, I've linked the statement in the description as what I believe to be a fair compromise is that you pause the video and read the whole thing now, then come back. I hope you listened and actually read it. What I bring this up for is because while the overall message, clear lines of what sort of mod is okay and reassurance that the killing of Mare isn't the start of a campaign against all mods is admirable, the reasoning misses a lot of key points, which I will rapid fire through. Yoshida implies that 14 mods exist because modding is a tradition inherent to PC gameplay as a whole, and it's inevitable. It is not. 14 is modded because vanilla customization is too limited, which he did address one part of, but not the entire issue. Yoshida also implies mods received with Mare rewrite and replace the original file. They do not. The original files remain uncorrupted, and that's the entire reason how the mods can be applied to only the person who sent them. If they replace the original file, then it would replace the item for everyone. I know this because that is what TextTools does. Yoshida also implies that being able to use mods for effectively cash shop piracy is the reason MogStation items have been selling poorly. It is not. Being able to quote-unquote trial the items using mods beforehand, and use that to find some glums you're actually going to use the pieces in, for example, actually increases the chance the person is going to buy them. The reason MogStation items have been selling poorly is because they're priced too high, and the recent ones aren't the best. Yoshida also implies that he might have to raise the sub price due to inflation. He does not. The reason 14 can't afford to operate is not inflation, but insufficient funding from the company. If the money earned by 14 actually went back into 14 instead of into another failure project for Square Enix, 14 would be much more comfortable. Also, you cannot afford to raise the subscription price, as the content being released already fails to justify the current price. If anything, it should be lowered. Lastly, the million-dollar question. Is this gonna kill the game? While I think that's certainly a possibility, it's also possible that it burns brighter than ever. The fact is, losing Mare means that while new content day will likely be unaffected, far fewer people will be willing to remain subbed between patches. If Square Enix stays their course despite knowing full well they've stabbed the golden geese, continuing to spend goodwill they don't have, then yes, the game will die. However, if this drop means Square Enix takes content quality with a bit more urgency, and it works and content becomes good again, that is how 14 will get out of the slump it's been in since Endwalker. Regardless of which way things go, whether the game dies for good or is reborn again, this moment is the one constant. Any 14 historian with half a brain will be able to look back on this and say, yes, this was the final decisive moment. It's just quite frankly way too big of a deal to not be considered as such. But thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this or learned something, comments and shares are greatly appreciated. 14 content isn't my usual inclination anymore, but if you're okay with variety, I stream multiple times a week. Joining my Discord is the best way to keep up to date on that. If you'd like to support me more directly, my Throne wishlist is linked in the description, which will allow you to send gifts directly to me at a variety of price ranges.